Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants will be on a listen-only mode until the question and answer session of today's conference. At that time, if you'd like to ask a question over the phone lines, please press star 1 on your phone and record your name at the prompt. This call is being recorded. If you have any objections, please disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to your host, Melissa Grosso. Thank you. You may begin.
Great. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to our third of 17 webinars. For those of you who joined us for the BIS and ITAR webinars, you did hear mention the importance of having an economic sanctions, paying attention to U.S. economic sanctions as part of a robust export compliance program. So I'm really pleased that we have two individuals from the Office of Foreign Assets Control under the Department of Treasury with us today. As a reminder, you can ask questions through the written queue, which is on the lower right-hand side of your screen. We will have an audio Q&A, as we have for previous webinars, at the end of the presentation. One final housekeeping note. For those of you who are on the ITAR webinar last Thursday, we are still working on some technical issues of getting the net replay out, but we hope to have that resolved within 24 hours or so. And with that, I'd like to, again, thank our speakers and welcome Zach Coughlin and Vanessa Durancourt from the Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Controls. Zach, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and hi everyone. Thank you for attending this OFAC 101 webinar today. We really appreciate your time. My name is Zach, and my co-facilitator is Vanessa, as previously stated. What we'll be covering today is on slide 2, the agenda slide. If you do have questions, we will have time at the end for a Q&A section. But to get started, the first section we will cover is OFAC Basics on slide 4. So OFAC's mission is to administer and enforce economic and trade sanctions based on U.S. foreign policy and national security goals against specially selected targets. These include, but are not limited to, foreign countries and their foreign regimes, terrorists, international narcotic traffickers, and war criminals and their support structures, and those engaged in activities related to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Sanctions are one tool, along with diplomatic and military options, that the U.S. uses to advance foreign policy. OFAC's mission is sweeping and requires wide-ranging actions to meet its goals. Oftentimes, this includes identifying foreign adversaries, developing sanctions programs against those adversaries, assisting U.S. persons in complying with sanctions prohibitions, and penalizing U.S. persons for violating these prohibitions. In many circumstances, OFAC works in cooperation with U.S. law enforcement. This coordination brings the full weight and influence of the federal government to advance U.S. foreign policy. OFAC's authority to impose controls on transactions and freeze assets under U.S. jurisdiction is based on constitutional, wartime, statutory authorities, and presidential, national emergency powers and other authorities granted by specific legislation. These actions are meant to preserve and protect the United States national security, foreign policy, and economy. Many of OFAC's sanctions are based on United Nations and other international agreements, are multilateral in scope, and involve close cooperation with other governments. Two acts which are most familiar or most related to OFAC are the IEEPA and TWIA Acts, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and the Trading with the Enemy Act. All right, moving on to slide 5, jurisdiction. Sanctions programs prohibit U.S. persons from most dealings with foreign adversaries and their support structures. U.S. persons are defined as, and it is laid out pretty clearly on the slide, but it is worth repeating that American citizens and permanent residents, aliens, wherever they are located, any individual, regardless of citizenship, who is physically located in the United States, and corporations organized under U.S. law, including foreign branches of U.S. companies, and in the case of Cuba and North Korea, foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies. Any corporation or company physically, as well as any corporation or company physically located in the United States. So slide 6 is specifically about the OFAC Sdn list. One of several U.S. government watch lists, the Specially Designated National, or Sdn list, is a compliance tool published by OFAC to assist U.S. persons in identifying foreign adversaries with whom it is illegal to do business. To help U.S. persons comply with sanctions, OFAC specially designates foreign adversaries, individuals, and entities by collecting evidence to show that their activities or relationships meet the criteria outlined in the executive order or statute imposing the sanctions. These individuals and entities are placed on the list of specially designated nationals and block persons or Sdn list. However, this list is not exhaustive. Collectively, all the designated parties included on this list are called the specially designated nationals, or SDNs. The integrated the list of these names is called the SDN list and is accessible through the OFAC website. U.S. persons are responsible for not dealing with sanctions targets regardless of whether or not these persons are on the Sdn list. For example, there are broad prohibitions on dealing with governments of sanctioned countries. Nevertheless, the Sdn list will not contain the names of all the government bodies of those countries. And we will have, there are slides at the end that do cover locations of these on the Treasury website. Slide 7, we'll go over general licenses and exemptions. In order to engage in a transaction that would otherwise be prohibited by OFAC, a person or persons must first obtain a license to engage in that activity. There are two kinds of licenses. A general license is a provision contained in OFAC's regulations which authorizes a particular type of transaction. A person does not need to apply for a general license because the regulation itself authorizes the transaction. A person engaging in a transaction pursuant to a general license must make sure that all conditions of the provision are strictly observed. On the other hand, a specific license is a written document issued by OFAC to a particular person or entity authorizing a particular transaction. Regulations may contain statements of OFAC's specific licensing policy with respect to particular transactions. Specific licenses are only issued in response to a written license application, meaning you would have to go into our website and apply for it. It's not similar to a general license in that it's open to the public to use. Programs also have exemptions and statements of licensing policy. An exemption is exactly that, a category of transaction exempt from the prohibition. For example, common exemptions are informational materials and travel, with the exception of Cuba. A statement of licensing policy is issued to clarify where OFAC stands on a topic or to clarify when it will consider reviewing specific licenses. All right, now we'll transition to from OFAC basics to sanctions programs. Slide 9. So OFAC administers and enforces 26 sanctions programs and maintains over 5,500 entries on the Sdn list. OFAC's objective is to identify, expose, isolate, impede, and incapacitate foreign adversaries and their support structures. OFAC accomplishes these objectives in 5 ways. First, by denying foreign adversaries access to the U.S. financial system and the ability to trade with U.S. companies. Second, by denying foreign adversaries the use of their property within possession or control of U.S. persons. Third, by working with the U.S. persons to help them meet their obligation to not have dealings with prohibited parties. Fourth, through coordination with other U.S. agencies to bring to bear the full weight and influence of the federal government, regulatory, diplomatic, defense, intelligence, and enforcement against these foreign adversaries and their support structures. And fifth, by working with other nations to implement similar strategies. Through outreach and compliance activities like this, OFAC provides assistance to U.S. persons in complying with the sanctions prohibitions. Oftentimes, this includes direct contact with financial institutions, importers, exporters, and individuals. Additional assistance is provided through our hotline, website, publications, presentations to government and industry groups. Again, we will be going over ways to contact us and website locations at the end of the presentation. The first of OFAC's primary tools is blocking the property and property interest of sanctions targets. Blocking, by definition, is an action that prohibits access to an account or property with respect to payments, transfers, exportations, withdrawals, or any other dealings except those pursuant to a license or other authorization from OFAC. Property and property interests are defined very broadly to include, but not limited to, money, checks, accounts, securities, mortgages, goods, ships, patents, insurance policies, services of any nature, contracts of any nature, and any other property, real, personal, mixed, tangible or intangible, or interest therein, direct or indirect, whether present, future, or contingent. The second tool involves restrictions on dealing with sanctions targets, providing limited or comprehensive prohibitions against the import, export of goods or services to or from the target. Okay. Slide 10 will be going over list-based programs. There is a breakdown in the programs that we administer. One is list-based, the second is comprehensive. List-based programs are numerous and vary in size and scope. In other words, list-based programs are typically restricting or prohibiting U.S. and or import of services, finance goods, and services involving prohibited parties, but there are no broad prohibitions against a country that is categorized as list or targeted. So a common one is the Balkans program, or the African programs, the programs against Venezuela. Those are list-based programs. You would need to be cognizant that an SDN is not involved in a transaction. For example, in the context of exporting or importing, U.S. persons are not allowed to trade with any individual or entity in a list-based country as long as the trade is not directly or indirectly benefiting a designated party. Let me restate that. U.S. persons are allowed to trade with any individual or entity in a list-based country as long as the trade is not directly or indirectly benefiting a designated party. Generally, licenses are normally associated with comprehensive programs since they are allowing for practices that would normally be restricted under broad prohibitions against a country or region, but not with list-based programs. There are exceptions, though, to this rule from Libya, which has a series of general licenses that allow for certain oil and gas transactions, investment in funds with minority interest from Libya government, etc., whereas list programs like Zimbabwe and Venezuela are more traditional list programs where the focus is just on ensuring that no party in an export-import transaction is prohibited. Slide 11, comprehensive programs. Comprehensive programs, which we did go over a little bit in list-based. The comprehensive sanctions programs are Cuba, Iran, Syria, Sudan, North Korea, and the region of Crimea. However, Sudan is temporarily suspended and will be revisited in July. As of right now, all transactions with regard to Sudan are authorized unless they are tagged under Darfur. But if they are only tagged under the Sudan program, they are authorized. Comprehensive programs broadly restrict exports and imports with countries or regions for U.S. persons and persons subject to U.S. jurisdiction. Slide 12, major prohibitions. This slide highlights the major prohibitions under each of the comprehensive programs, with one major exception. The 2017 Sudan Rule, which we just spoke about, amends the Sudan Sanctions Regulations effective January 17, 2017. Again, this is a nice, simplified, distilled version of the major prohibitions, but while it is a nice slide to have, and you will get the slides after the presentation, you still need to check for the regulations. They are nuanced, they are complicated, so make sure this isn't your Bible per se. Slide 13, general licenses and exemptions. This is another good slide that highlights the exemptions and major licenses for each program. Again, it is important to note that while the distillation of regulations into a PowerPoint is useful and illustrates broad ideas, it is imperative to always read the regulations or call or write in for clarification. At this point, I think I'll hand it over to Vanessa.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vanessa Durenencourt. Thank you, Zach, for that information. Very informative and lots of useful slides that you can take back to your workplaces to review and share with others. We're going to move on now to sanction compliance strategies. And starting on slide number 15, sanctions compliance. OFAC doesn't have a written requirement, written requirement for a compliance program, but we do expect that there is compliance, that that entities, that consultants or different industries are reviewing their policies and procedures for accuracy and for any potential violations to prevent that. There's no one-size-fits-all for an OFAC compliance program. each program is uniquely tailored to your specific industry. You have to take into consideration the risk and the situation. Please keep in mind that in enforcement action, OFAC is strict liability, and in enforcement action against your organization and will lead to negative publicity, and that's not something that you want. So we're here to help you and provide some strategies. So moving on to slide number 16, the basic pillars of a compliance program. There are 4 pillars to the compliance program. Starting with the first one is a risk assessment. A risk assessment is when you're evaluating the customer risk, the product risk, and the geographic risk. The second is the internal controls. When you're screening, your due diligence, are you mitigating for any risk? The third is training and personnel. How often are you training your personnel? Are the goals clear? Do they know what is expected of them? And do you have the right people in the right place to perform at an optimal level? And lastly, the independent testing and audit. This is, are you evaluating, are you testing your program, are you identifying any areas of shortcoming, and coming up with any types of remediation. So quickly, before we move on, I want to talk about a little bit about the customer risk, product risk, and geographic under risk assessment. The geographic risk is exactly that, a risk for the area. It's transactions that either originate, pass through, or terminate in high-risk jurisdictions where there may be inadequate regulatory standards, or there's a high risk for crime, corruption, drug trafficking, or terrorist activities. We covered that in some of the slides, which slides 11 and 12, which you should be familiar with, that discusses the jurisdictions. You want to have an understanding, or at least a familiarity, of what type of business your customer's in, and with whom are they conducting these transactions. What's their product line? Where is it originating? Where is it terminating? Is there a possibility for it to be re-exported to a sanctioned area? These are all questions to ask and to have at the forefront when you're reviewing your policies and procedures. Moving to slide 17. So again, it's important to have an understanding, or at a minimum, some type of familiarity with the various sanction programs, the related export and import prohibitions, which we presented for you in slide 12 and 13. And as Zach stated, the information is ever changing, but slides 12 and 13, those charts, they're great to take back and keep them posted nearby, so it gives you a template, an idea of where transactions are allowed, or what is and what is not allowed. And of course, you could always call OFAC's hotline if you have more questions. Also have an understanding of the property, the assets that come within the U.S. or the possession or control of a U.S. person, if they're to be blocked, or especially if they can't be transferred out, paid, or dealt with. You have to have that understanding when you're conducting your risk assessment. So you want to start by identifying areas of high risk. Areas of high risk can be the size and location. That's when you take into consideration your organization and your business. The second is your customer base. How well do you know your customers? In the banking terms, this is called Know Your Customers, KYC. Partners, who are the partners? Are your brokers, your agents, your intermediaries, your suppliers? Who are your partners? Who are they doing business with? The products, are you confident in what the products are that you may be importing or exporting? Are you speculating? Make sure you have a good understanding of that. And lastly, the transactions. The complexity of the transaction, are these cross-border transactions, and is there a potential for diversion? Simply stated, potential diversion, if they tell you they're going to one country, but then they're re-exported to another. And you want to know, where are the products ending? Slide 18, the internal controls. When we talk about internal controls, it's 2 parts. It's your policies and it's your procedures. The first part, policy, is outlining what the company should be doing or should not be doing. Again, you want to make sure these are clear and your staff has an understanding of it and what's expected of them. So your policies, they can be broad or narrow. They want to be clearly communicated and easily available. It creates a culture of compliance and ensure that your staff has support from senior management. So compliance is not just at the lower level, it's at all levels. And procedures. It outlines the steps that the employees must take to ensure there's compliance with policies and what they can do to mitigate any risk. It can be step-by-step instructions for each process. Again, this is contingent upon each person's responsibilities. It would be specifically tailored to job function. Procedures work in tandem with your policies. Procedures are easy to follow, and oftentimes you will ask your staff for assistance to help develop procedures. Your frontline is usually apt at helping with this and designing this, since they are, like I said, the front line, and they are the ones dealing with this day in and day out. So, moving on to slide 19, also discusses internal control. Screening. What are you screening for? If you're using OFAC's Sdn list, which Zach briefly touched upon in the beginning, what are you screening for? Are you only looking at names of individuals and business owners, vessels that they may be using? Are you screening for addresses or only the country? How are you screening? Are you using a software tool? Again, are you going directly to OFAC's webpage and using the Sdn? Or is someone doing this manually? And what are you screening for? So are you screening, how are you screening, and what are you screening for? And that is the foundation of an effective compliance program. Record keeping. Are you researching your customers' accounts, their information, their end user statements, export licenses if it applies, shipment and freight forward documentation? Do you have these records? This is also part of your due diligence. Do you have this information to know more about the products and where they're going or where they're coming from? Slide 20. We dive deeper into screening. So we talked about screening the Sdn list, but also take into consideration screening documents as part of your due diligence. Here's a chart where we lay out common documents that you may see depending on your industry. We have transportation documents, sale documents, financial documents. So we're talking about your purchase orders, your invoices, your end user certificates, financial documents, your payment methods. Again, this all is relative to the type of business that you're in, but this is a great cheat sheet, for lack of better words, on what kind of documents to take into consideration when you're screening. Are you looking for information on the Sdn list, or are you also looking for information within these documents that you may have available to you, or perhaps your team, someone else within the team has it available? Slide 21, training. Training is important because your staff needs to know what's expected of them. They should also be familiar with OFAC Sanction Compliance. You should have at least one qualified individual within all industries who's responsible for the day in and day out of the OFAC Sanction Compliance. That individual, you could have one, you could have two, they perhaps can wear several hats, but at least one person should be familiar with it. Training is essential for all employees, again, from the top down, front line, doesn't matter what part of the industry, but training is essential. The training and how often training is provided, it's, again, based on risk assessment. It's tailored specifically to your industry, your line of work. We do at least expect training once a year. Make sure the training goals are clear, the objectives are clear, and if there is shortcoming or it requires remediation, that it's tended to quickly and not allowed to progress, and perhaps it becomes a bigger issue later on down the line. So, again, training is essential. Slide 22, independent testing and auditing. So what we want to look at here is what's the purpose of independent testing? It's to identify any deficiencies within a compliance program and formulate corrective measures. One good strategy to keep in mind is when OFAC has a recent action which you can see all of our actions are posted on our webpage under the Recent Actions page. Have a quick look, take a glance at what the situation was, the penalty that may have been assessed, and ask yourself, are we privy to this? Can we, are we exposed to something similar to this? Is there an area that we can change? So learn from the mistakes of others, is like I like to say. With testing and auditing, testing should be performed either internally by an outside auditor, consultant, or another qualified independent party. It should be comprehensive enough to assess compliance with OFAC and make sure that the compliance program is specifically tailored to your industry. The scope and frequency is based on your organization's risk assessment, any internal changes and external changes. So when we refer to internal, external changes, perhaps there are internal developments. You have changes in personnel. Does someone leave? Is someone replacing them? Have they been trained? Maybe there's changes at the operational level. Perhaps you're offering a new product or a new service, or your sales team is aiming at a new client base. Again, take into consideration OFAC sanctions and make a risk assessment. Organizational changes, was there a recent merge or reorganization? External development, any new sanction programs that are announced by OFAC, or changes to existing programs. Zach mentioned at the start of our presentation the Sudan change that may go into effect on July 12th. We are expecting an update as of July 12th. So we encourage you to monitor our OFAC Recent Action page and announcements to so that we're all aware of what happens with the Sudan program. Any new sanction tools that may be available on the market, any published guidance that we may have, or again, as I mentioned earlier, any OFAC published enforcement actions. Learn from the mistakes of others. And like I already stated, remedial responses, are you identifying any deficiencies that perhaps your outside auditors or your consultants pointed out? Are you responding to any patterns and trends that you can make some changes to? Now we're going to talk about enforcement overview. As I stated earlier, OFAC is strict liability, but let's talk about some of the steps that we take to get there. So slide 24. This takes you through what our enforcement overview. You have, starting from left to right, an apparent violation. If there's an apparent violation and it's disclosed to OFAC in the form of a correspondence, and we have the information gathering phase where we're going to either subpoena or send a request for information. We're going to analyze the information that's submitted to us, and there can be 3 steps, starting with the no action or cautionary letter. There can be a pre-issuance notice of penalty or finding of violation. FOV stands for finding of violation, or a settlement. And then lastly, penalty notice or finding of violation. Again, most of our cases, you'll see in the next few slides, they end up in cautionary letters. So if you turn to slide 25, from the bottom, from again left to right, no action letter is by severity, least severe, then followed by cautionary letter, finding a violation, a civil penalty, and or a criminal referral when we refer out to the Department of Justice or other interagency partners when it comes to criminal referral. Slide 26 tells you what happens most often by volume. As I stated, no action letters or cautionary letters are a big part of our correspondence when we received a potential notice of when we receive a disclosure from the industry. And the least common is a criminal referral. That slide's very easy to understand. Slide 27. So what do we take into consideration is OFAC's enforcement guidelines. We will evaluate what we call general factors A through K. Was there willful or reckless conduct? Did the industry have knowledge of the transaction? Was there a harm to the sanction program objectives? And we'll take into consideration individual characteristics of the company, the size, sophistication, And some of our administrative options when we're going to close a case is closing a case internally, issuing a no action or cautionary letter. Again, this comprises about 90% of our correspondence. Issuing a finding of violation or civil monetary penalty, entering into a settlement, or making a criminal referral. All the postings are on our webpage under recent actions. Slide 28 discusses our penalty. This is, as of last year, Congress has voted to have it adjust for inflation, but this gives you an idea for each program. Trading with the enemy, the IEPA, or foreign narcotics. The penalty, maximum penalty amount as of August 2016 for each transaction, and of course the related relevant inflation factor. As you can tell, it gets pretty costly if there is a finding of violation or an assessment of a penalty. Slide 29, the OFAC Enforcement Overview. I said it and I'll repeat it one more time. We publish our information on our webpage under the Civil Penalties and Enforcement page. And companies can gain valuable insight or lessons learned from mistakes of others. So you want to, when you're reviewing these, take into consideration what led to that apparent violation. Is your company engaging in a similar type of conduct? Does your company share a similar risk factor? What controls compliance controls do you have within your organization? And what compliance deficiencies may have occurred? Zach is going to take us into resources that are available to industry, starting with slide 31.
All right. So thank you, Vanessa. Slide 31 starts all of our resources. OFAC has a wide variety of tools for the public to use. For instance, this page, a lot of our web-based products, including the recent actions page where we post penalty cases, designations, etc. We also have provided our Sdn Search Tool, which can be useful in determining a false positive. However, I believe this will be sent out in PDF form, so I'm not sure if the links will work. But if you just go to treasury.gov, and at the top of the page, it should have I wrote a note on it. It should say Resource Center, and it'll have a drop-down window, and you click on Financial Sanctions, and that will be the page where you will have the entirety of OFAC's free to the public tools. In slide 32, this highlights probably one of the more important web pages we have, the Recent Actions page. That's where we post designations, we'll post penalty cases there, anything public that OFAC publishes will be on Recent Actions. We also have the nifty new search tool on Recent Actions. Welcome to the 21st century. And you can sign up for email updates. So anytime we post something to Recent Actions, you will get an email update. And if you look at the dates there, in March we had 4. We might have more than that. So between March 7th and March 17th, we had 4 emails that went out. So we're not bombarding you with emails. It's only the imperative stuff that we post on Recent Actions. You won't get 50% off deals. Slide 33 is the Resource Center. That's what I was discussing earlier. You can find it simply by going to treasury.gov under the Resource Center tab at the very top of the page. There'll be a drop-down, click on Financial Sanctions. That's everything related to OFAC that you need. The Sdn Search Tool is on there. The licensing page is on there. FAQs are on there. So that would be a good place to start. And finally, OFAC contact information. And again, these slides I'm pretty sure will be sent out, so you don't have to write down. But if you can also just simply Google OFAC contact information, and our phone number will pop up. We are one of the more accessible government agencies as far as through the phone goes, and we do man the phones and the email every day. So if you're not getting an answer, there might be something wrong. Maybe your email didn't go through, maybe your phone call didn't go through, so don't be shy. You can call back. I do want to thank you very much for your time. We will open the floor up to questions at this point.
Great. Thank you, Zach and Vanessa. Operator, can you remind folks how they can get into the queue for questions?
Certainly. If you'd like to ask a question over the phone line, please press *1. Make sure your phone is unmuted and record your name at the prompt.
And while we wait, I have a quick question, Vanessa and Zach. Oftentimes companies will review the country sanction programs for a particular country and still have some questions as to whether, or uncertainty as to whether or not they need to apply for a license. What is your recommendation for their next step? Would it be to contact you guys via email and phone?
I'm sorry, so you asked that, you stated that oftentimes companies will review our sanctions page for sanctions with certain countries?
So they'll read through the specific country sanctions and have a question. Still have an unclarity as to whether their company needs to apply for a license for that particular transaction.
Yeah, so they would call in our hotline. They would give us some details, preferably the more information the better, so that we can make an assessment on whether or not there's a general license for the activity. Perhaps they may have overlooked it. I know the webpage has a plethora of information, so perhaps there's a general license, and because we do this day in and day out, we have more knowledge on that. We can share that information. And if there's not, then we can direct them to apply for a license. But the hotline's always available. Zach, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, just real quick. And if the question is particularly complex, it's better to write into the OFAC_feedback at treasury.gov. And I don't know if you can put that slide 34 back up just so everybody can look at the contact info. There is an underscore in OFAC feedback at treasury.gov. If it's complex, go ahead and write in. We do answer. And if it's I mean, it's up to you whether you're going to determine it's complex or not, but if it's a simple GL question or maybe a more complicated remittance question or a simple Sdn question, you can call in. But either way, we'll get back to you.
Great, thank you. And we had a question come in over the written queue, which is how often should a recipient or company be screened?
How often, again, it's a risk assessment. We cannot tell them to screen once a week, once a month. There's always changes. The changes can happen at any time. When I say changes, that's updates to the Sdn list, everything from additions to the Sdn list to removal of names. This can happen at any time. So I would recommend something that's relevant to unique to their organization. If they are dealing with high-risk entities or high-risk areas, then perhaps more often, as opposed to your industries that may not be dealing with high-risk entities and they do everything domestic. So again, it's a risk assessment and it's specifically tailored to the size and complexity of the products that they offer.
Great, thank you. And operator, did we have any questions come in over the audio queue?
Yes, we do have one question in queue currently, and that's from Roger Bartholomew. Your line is open.
Yeah, question on the slideshows. We were told that the last one that we would get copies, and I never have received a copy. And who should I talk to make sure I'm getting copies of these presentations?
You should have received that, sir. You can email me following this presentation, and we can get that rectified.
And your email address is in the invite?
Yes, it is. It's melissa.grosso@trade.gov.
All right. Thank you.
Operator, do we have any other questions in the queue?
At this moment, there are no other questions.
Zach, Vanessa, thank you guys again. Did you have any? Actually, I'm sorry, we had one more question come in over the written queue. The question is, we are currently exporting to Syria from Canada. Would the OFAC rules still apply?
We need a little more information. Is it a U.S. company? Are there U.S. persons involved?
Currency.
U.S. currency involved? Is it transiting a U.S. bank?
If the person who asked that question would actually, the answer is yes.
Yes.
I'm not sure yes to all. If the person, if you'd like to hit *1, it might be easier to have this as a discussion versus over the written queue.
Again, as a reminder, please press *1 and record your name to ask any questions over the phone line. We do have one in queue. It'll just be a moment. and our next question comes from Jen Lee. Your line is open.
Hi, I'm the one that posted the question about shipping from Canada.
Sure. Is it a U.S. company?
Yes, we're the U.S. company, and there's the payment transaction is in U.S. dollar, and it's just the product originated from Canada.
Yeah, they are subject. It sounds like, and again, you can write in and we can discuss this further, but it does sound like you would be subject to sanctions or sanctions regulations.
So if you look at slide number 5 that Zach covered at the beginning, it talks about basic OFAC jurisdiction, and it's U.S., right in the middle, U.S. entities, U.S. incorporated entities, and transactions directly or indirectly that involve the United States or a U.S. person. That within itself lets you know that if a U.S. person is involved, then they must comply with OFAC sanctions. If you want to call in to the hotline, as Zach stated, or write in, you're welcome to. We do ask for more information, but keeping it very simple and for everyone, if a U.S. person is involved, you are subject to OFAC compliance.
Okay, so which hotline should I call?
Contact information. Our contact information is on slide 34.
And it's the slide that's currently active.
Okay, the phone number is the toll-free number is 1-800-540-6322. I repeat,
email.
The email is
OFAC feedback.
Correct.
OFAC_feedback@treasury.gov.
And again, you'll be getting these slides following the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Operator, any other questions?
There are no other questions at this time. I was just about to give a reminder. But if you would like to ask any questions over the phone line, please press *1 and record your name. I believe we do have a question coming through. It'll just be a few moments.
Great, thank you.
Our next question comes from Jordan. Your line is open.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I work primarily with defense trade. ITAR, export licenses with DDTC or for some items, commerce. If I get approval on a DSP-5, would I need to also ask approval on one of your licenses for a transaction?
If the transaction involves Iran, then yes, you want to make sure we have a general license. We would need more details. Again, your question is a bit more specific.
That was just a hypothetical, to any one of them. Like I said, if we go through the State Department for approval on a certain license for defense commodities, and they approve it, based on whatever criteria may be, would you also need additional approval from you for the same transaction?
I think in a majority of cases, probably not. But again, each program is different. So when you're dealing with Iran, you would need to deal with OFAC. There are other programs where Bureau of Industry and Security is in charge of exports. There's a lot of instances where Customs and Border Protection would have jurisdiction over imports. But when you are dealing with any comprehensively sanctioned country, you may want to at least give us a call to double check. In cases where it's not comprehensively sanctioned, you would want to make sure you're not dealing with an Sdn.
Right. Of course. And your licenses, are there any special registration requirements or how does your licensing process work? I know the State Department kind of ITAR-centric. They have certain requirements. Do you all have registration requirements or special licensing requirements at all?
So our licensing application, so let's just go back so we're all on the same page. You're referring to ITAR, which specifically deals with Iran, for those that are also listening in and are not familiar with that. So there's two. OFAC has jurisdiction. It's a sanctioned country. So you do have to go through OFAC, and because you're referring specifically to defense items, you also have to go through Bureau of Industry and Service, through Commerce. So with OFAC, the licensing application is something you would complete online. It's as stated, an application where you would provide details about your organization and details about who you plan on doing business with and the products. There's a narrative section which is open for your complete description. The more information for our licensing officials, the better it is. If your item is an EAR 99 and you have that type of information, you would go ahead and put that in the narrative. And that's, again, if you're required to have a specific license. Whether or not you require a specific license depends on your products. And that's something that we wouldn't dive into on a webinar. We would dive into that in more detail through a phone call. Right. But as we were saying, you'd have to apply for a license. If you're required to apply for a license, you would complete all the details on your product and who you're conducting business with in the narrative portion, and the licensing officer would then review it, and if they have additional questions, they would follow up directly. Neither one of us is with licensing, so we cannot answer more questions and more specific questions about the licensing process. We are with compliance. We'll be happy to discuss that offline if you need more details.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And another quick question, which is, what is the time frame to get approval on a license?
And that's the question of the day. We get that all the time. We like to say there's no specific timeline. It depends on the complexity, the details, and the sanction program, and any current policies or foreign policies that the administration is taking into consideration. What we like to say on the line, it can take a minimum 90 days, sometimes longer. There are licenses that sit there a little longer. It depends on the complexity and the details provided. If you provide an application where you're just saying your name and your product and you're not saying anything else, and you're saying, hey, I'm going to ship this out to Iran or Cuba, and you're not giving any more details, then of course the licensing officer is going to ask for more information, but that will just prolong your process. So you want to make sure you provide more information. So that's the answer. There's no definite answer.
An operator will do one final check for the audio queue.
Okay. Once again, if you would like to ask a question from the phone lines, please press *1 and record your name. And I'm showing no further questions.
Great. Well, again, Vanessa and Zach, thank you so much for lending your expertise today. Encourage folks to either call the OFAC hotline or email the OFAC feedback line with any further questions, any specific questions. Again, you will be getting a net replay of this webinar as well as the slides within 24 hours. So thank you again and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your participation in today's conference. You may now disconnect.